I was having an issue.
The microphone.
Microphones in the room, in your room. Okay, are you getting an echo still?
Yes, so there is an echo. Is the echo coming? ¿Viene de aquí o de donde él está?
No sé si su monitor y su micrófono están muy cerca de lo que está generando.
No, pero es que el eco viene de aquí.
Y solo hay un micrófono encendido.
Maybe, Matt, let's check something. Let's try to turn off your microphone just a second, just to see if the echo is generated here or at your end. Could you please do that, Matt?
Me, turn it off.
Yes, turn off your mic. Listo. No, o sea que es aquí.
Tuyo, Ricardo.
No.
¿Cómo se esconde?
El eco es de aquí. A lo mejor hay que pagar.
A ver, ahí. ¿Se escucha? Ya. Ahí se escucha. Sí.
Okay, so can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, so Matt,
Yeah.
as I was saying, thank you very much. Bueno, sigue el eco.
No. Sí, es que ahora ahí está. Si puedo apagar el micrófono de su laptop y usamos algo que está ambiental. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Ahí está.
Okay. Now apparently we're back. So as I was saying, thank you very much for being here today. We look forward very much to your talk. And I will be chairing your session, which go together since they are relatives.
Yeah.
So Matthew Duncombe, Relativity, and Stoic, Doubly incomplete later. So
Thank you so much. Yes. Has everyone got the handout?
Yes. Yes.
I'll share it on my screen.
No, I think Do you have it by any chance in PDF?
Yeah, I can share it on my screen, shall I?
Yes.
Yeah,
On your
okay.
screen, and if you can send it to us by through the chat,
Yes.
possible.
Okay, yeah. So is that sharing my screen?
That's
And
the screen.
I'll send it via the chat. Chat.
So, se puede proyectar acá en esta.
Sí, esto es lo que está viendo.
Is that okay? You can see it via the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. The reasons are complicated and kind of unfortunate. And yes, thank you so much to Ricardo and everyone for being so accommodating of having me. So my talk is about relativity and Stoic doubly incomplete Lekta, and it connects to. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. Is that okay?
Yes.
So yes, it connects to some work that I'd done on relativity more generally in ancient Greek philosophy, where I'd argued that sort of none of the really canonical authors have this so-called incompleteness view of relativity, but we do find that view in ancient sources. So then the question for this paper is, well, where does that incompleteness view come from? And I'm going to try and suggest that it's from some of the Stoic tradition, in particular Athenodorus, who is a Stoic mentioned in several of the Neoplatonist commentaries. So I'll just read my abstract and then I'll talk through the handout. So an ancient source.
Can we ask you just one thing, Matt? Could you please enlarge the document so that we can see it?
Is that better?
Yeah. There.
And did he send it?
He did, but I could do it. But I will send it to you by email.
Okay.
Okay.
Shall I put it in the chat now as well? Actually, if you, I'll try.
Yes.
Let me add it from. So, sorry, I've got to go through my file system now. Relativity and incomplete. So this one. There we go. I'll send the PDF there. So that should be right now. That should be in the chat. Is that right?
Yes.
Great. Lovely. Yes, I'm told that Ricardo puts on a great conference, so I'm really sorry to be there. Okay, so an ancient source, the so-called Divisions of Aristotle, attributes to Plato a distinction between absolute and relative terms. Now, this source says that items in Plato's category of relativity are incomplete linguistic predicates. The ancient view that Plato has a category of relativity that are incomplete predicates has been quite widespread in recent scholarship on ancient ideas of relativity. And not only that, but it also happens to be a key part of Frege's account of the semantics of relations. However, I've recently argued that neither Plato nor Aristotle holds an incompleteness view of relativity. And if I'm right that none of those canonical figures, I also make the same claims about Sextus. The Stoics are a bit more of a complicated picture. That raises a kind of puzzle, right? So how did the idea that relative things are incomplete predicates come about? And how did this become a mainstream reading of relativity in Plato? In this paper, I'm going to argue that the view that relatives are incomplete predicates originates with a certain Stoic, Athenodorus, who's named in several Neoplatonist commentaries on Aristotle's categories. I have several reasons for this view. First, Stoic semantics, and among ancient approaches, only Stoic semantics endorses incomplete predicates of the relevant doubly incomplete kind. So I'll go into some explanation about what that means in a minute. And there's evidence that Athenodorus was an orthodox Stoic in this respect. So it's likely he had this kind of move available. Second, we know from a report in Porphyry that Athenodorus and Cornutus read and criticized Aristotle's categories on the basis of reading it as pertaining to linguistic items rather than items in the world. Third, there is direct evidence from Simplicius' commentary that Athenodorus read Aristotle's relatives as incomplete predicates, and that Cornutus could not have originated the view. And then I'm going to, at the end, speculate about whether this view could have first been attributed to Plato by Boethus of Sidon, and maybe the view, there's some reason to think that this kind of view originated with Chrysippus. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to say a little bit more about the incompleteness reading of relativity and where that comes from and how it gets, where people find it in Plato. So this is the basic idea of the incompleteness reading of relativity. This is Owen's formulation in his paper on the relatives argument in the Periodion. We may say for convenience that one, as we apply it to things, is an incomplete predicate, and that accordingly, as we complete it this way or that, it will be true or false of the thing to which it is applied. So the idea here is quite simple. We've got a term, a linguistic item, one, and I can say one table or one chair, but I can't simply say one, right? The idea is that you've got to complete the semantic or the syntax of a sentence involving one with some complement. Now, what's the basis of attributing this kind of view to Plato? So the basis that Owen cites is a part of the divisions of Aristotle. This is several of you have worked a lot on the divisions of Aristotle, so I'll not say too much about it, but this is basically a set of divisions that are attributed by, in this case, Diogenes Laertius, although the divisions of Aristotle do exist in several other versions. This is the one that we happen to find at the end of Diogenes' Life of Plato. And what it claims to be is a set of divisions that Aristotle attributes to Plato. So Diogenes reporting what purports to be Aristotle's attribution to Plato of a set of divisions. And one of these divisions is this. Beings, some are spoken of in themselves, others are spoken of relative to something. The things spoken of in themselves are all of those things which lack nothing in their interpretation. These would be, for example, man, horse, and other animals, and none of these advances through interpretation. So the thought here is that what people read this as saying is that where you can say Socrates is a man, and you don't need to say anything else. You've just got a complete syntactic unit and a complete semantic unit. But then those things spoken of relative to something else are all those which lack something in their interpretation. For example, the larger than something, and the quicker than something, and the more beautiful, and such like. For the larger is larger than the smaller, and the quicker is quicker than something. So amongst beings, some things are said to be themselves by themselves, others relative to something. In this way, he used to divide the things according to Aristotle. That's Plato used to divide the things. So this is where people get this incompleteness view and attribute it to Plato from. So what is the kind of meaning of this incompleteness view? What view is attributed to Plato here? Yes, as I said. Okay, so right, so that's the kind of incompleteness view. The other thing to note here is that people also say, well, this is just a very late source. Can we push this contrast between absolute and relative terms that we're given in the Diogenes divisions of Aristotle? Can we push that back further, closer to Plato's own time? Well, one answer to that is Hermodorus. We have a source in Hermodorus, of Hermodorus in Simplicius, where Hermodorus seems to attribute to Plato. Hermodorus has this view, but Hermodorus is so chronologically close to Plato and a part of the Academy that people say, well, maybe this is a source for a distinction between absolute and relative terms in Plato. And this is that text there. He says, amongst beings, some are absolute kathauta, and such as man and horse, others are relative to others, pros hetera, and of these, some are relative to opposites, pros enantia, such as good and bad, while others of these are relative to something, pros t, and of these, some are definite and some indefinite. Now, that doesn't really show that. All that at best that shows is the contrast between absolute and relative goes back to the academy. It doesn't show that the particular version of the contrast that we get in Diogenes, namely this one with incomplete predicates that need something else for their interpretation, goes all the way back to the academy. So, I mean, the evidentiary source for this is quite the evidence for attributing this view to Plato is quite weak, but nonetheless, that's what people have done. Okay. So I'm going to say a little bit more now about what the incompleteness reading is, because the question is going to be, well, where does this idea come from of incomplete predicates? And later on a little bit, I'm going to say how it speculate about how it comes to be attributed to Plato. But the main focus of the paper is, where does this view come from if it's not found in Plato? Okay, so here's the incompleteness reading, and I'm just going to break it down into the way that people tend to articulate it. There are two Platonic categories, the absolute and the relative, the kathauta and the pros t. Lots of people seem to sign up for this view. I've given some of the references there. The Diogenes Laertius text and other divisions of Aristotle texts give some external evidence for this being attributed to Plato. I've just disputed some of that. There is some internal evidence, namely Sophist 255c14, where we seem to get a distinction between absolute and relative and relatives. So maybe there's this category distinction, and one of the categories is the relative. But what is that category of relatives? Well, things in the category of relatives need something for their interpretation. So there are various ways in the way this could be understood. One would be, this is according to, would be, for example, to say that larger is, to use the term larger, I need to give a complement, right? So in order to use the term, I need a complement or interpretation for their use. So if I want to say Socrates is larger than Simmias, I've got to complete that sentence with Simmias. I can't just say Socrates is larger than. Another possibility would be that I think is left open by the Diogenes Laertius is that something is needed for the definition. So to define the term larger, to say what it is to be larger, I've got to mention the term smaller. So what people typically do, however, is pretty much everyone takes the
So it's not gonna happen. There's a connection problem, when it doesn't get here. So, does anybody have Matt's spelling?
Telephone number?
Yeah.
I can look. I mean, yeah, I mean, if it's a deep failure, yes,
Well, if there's a recycling, yeah, it doesn't have access to his phone either. And
Well, when it's put it down.
make it clear.
So maybe bring that fire just.
You started.
I think we should maybe give it a few more minutes, but if you want to do that.
Yes.
Okay. Because anyway, the meeting of future minutes reels this opportunity to that. Yeah.
He says, really sorry, my roll has gone down and won't seem to reconnect. I try rebooting. So yes, maybe we could do what you suggest. And give him a time not to try. Is everyone happy with that? Okay. So let's do that. Let me invite him.
No, this is like interesting. There's a lot of text.
You're the one.
Forest good.
So you forest gardening.
We have a yeah,
Of your things.
thanks, yeah.
I didn't look into this. No.
Oh, the longer one.
Oh, the longer one. Oh, no, we don't. But I can send it by email if that's right. Or you can. You're right.
There?
And there's something that's not.
If you have it, yeah, I didn't know if we were gonna print the longer one, but
Yes.
that's,
Yes.
is it possible to print one version just for anyone?
Yes.
I think that would take just a moment, right? And then I'll pass around these. So this has most of the passages. There's a few more on that. And then the handout that I sent around this morning has got the structure of the paper. So yeah.
Right, yes.
Okay.
Y luego me vas a hacer así, otras 10 de reunión. Un poco más fácil. Tienes una la baja y tienes okay. So we bring one copy and then go back and make more and bring more. Okay. And I told them, yeah, so your session would last as 4 sessions. 1 hour and 30. So that will be 1 o'clock. And then at 1:15 we'll start with, we resume with.
No vamos a presentar un documento, ¿no? Para español. Sí.
Will you project anything or
well, you can, if you have my handout on the, something already connected to the screen, then you could just project it, or I can also do it from.
Si se lo manda usted lo puede pedir.
Si lo pone en la computadora, no doy el pasador de diapositivas para que vaya haciendo.
Pero como
Hi there.
una otra.
¿Tiene un puerto de
Isn't that better? Oh.
Yeah, sorry. So I'm really sorry. Eduroam has just gone down here. And so it's booted me from the connection. I've reconnected with my phone as a Wi-Fi hotspot. So I don't know if you can hear me okay?
Yes, you can. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Would you like me to carry on or would you like to move on to the next session?
Okay.
It's better. I think we're already in it. Yeah.
Okay, very well. So carry on.
Okay. Right, so let me reshare my screen.
I sent you by email the handouts. Yeah, you can look at them.
Yeah. So if I can share my screen, it might still work. Is that working now for sharing?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Okay, so I'll try and carry on until my phone dies or who knows what. And then, yeah, sorry. Unfortunately, I'm stunned that Eduroam's not working. So, okay. Yes, so the category of relativity needs something for its interpretation. And all of the items in the category are these sort of dyadic predicates. That is to say, they've got, as it were, two gaps, two subject places. So is a father of, Sophroniscus is a father of, can't be used just on its own. You've got to complete it with Socrates is a father of Sophroniscus is a father of Socrates. Now, I've argued in various places that neither Plato nor Aristotle endorse this incompleteness view, maybe because because of the connection issues, I'm running short of time. I'll just very quickly gloss over this part 2, which essentially argues that, or repeats some of my arguments that Plato and Aristotle don't endorse this view. The long and the short of it is Plato and Aristotle don't tend to think of relativities as linguistic items. They tend to think of them as items in the world. You can see that from some of these, the passage there are given in a symposium, right? It's the father, tinos, that is that's the relative. It's not the expression being a father that's the relative. The thing that does the relating. So it's not a predicate. It's not indeed predicates at all. So it's not linguistic items. It's not predicates at all. Very frequently in Plato and Aristotle, you find the relatives described using a substantive. So the father, that's the thing that's relative, rather than the attribute or property being a father. Plato and Aristotle, you also get this kind of commitment or maybe question about whether any relatives can be reflexive, whether there can be any self relations. It comes up in the Charmides, in the Sophist. Category 7 simply defines relatives as things that are allio-relative. And so, again, that is inconsistent with the incompleteness view, because for the incompleteness view, there's absolutely no reason why Socrates is the same as Socrates is an illegitimate relativity. It's just in Plato and Aristotle, it wouldn't be, because sameness can't be a relative, because all relatives are allio-relative. And another more controversial claim is that Plato and Aristotle tend to think of relatives as exclusively related to their correlative. So Socrates is a father. Well, he could be father of Dion and father of Dion, right? So Socrates doesn't exclusively relate to any any correlative, whereas on the incompleteness view, but actually we very find quite frequently in Plato and Aristotle the idea that relatives do relate exclusively to their correlative. So being a father is relative only to, a father is relative only to offspring, something like that. Okay, so that's just a very brief outline of the incompleteness view and why we don't find it in Plato and Aristotle. Now that leaves us with a bit of a puzzle. Why is it that where does this view come from if it's not in Plato and Aristotle, and how does it get attributed to Plato and Aristotle? So I'm going to suggest that it's some Stoic or other introduced the incompleteness reading, and then I'm going to try and narrow that down a bit onto which Stoic. Now, here's the reason to think that some Stoic or other introduced the incompleteness reading. We know a fair bit about Stoics in the kind of 1st century BC and the first century of our era, particularly Athenodorus and Cornutus, from various bits of Neoplatonist commentary on the category 7 and so we know a little bit about their views. Now, in general, the Stoic semantics seems to have the required idea of doubly incomplete predicates, right? The doubly incomplete Lekta. That would be consistent with the linguistic and doubly incomplete nature of the incompleteness reading of relativity. So I'll just read you this this bit of text, Diogenes DL 763, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Incomplete is the content that has the expression unfinished. For example, is writing, for we ask who, so who is writing. Complete is a content that has the expression finished. For example, Socrates is writing. Categoremata are then among the incomplete contents, that is Lekta, and propositions, axiomata, are among the complete contents. So obviously this is a very well-known text concerning the incomplete predicates and the ones of which we have to epizetoumen, of which we ask whom. So who is writing? Now, this text gets us part of the way to the incompleteness reading because it's about predicates and it's about those predicates being incomplete and needing completion with a single subject term. Doesn't get us all the way to the incompleteness reading, which needs two subject terms. But I think we can start by noticing that writes, it has this feature of variable polyadicity. So Socrates writes, of course, we can ask who's writing, right? Who's writing? Socrates. But we can also, and that would be a complete syntactic unit, or we can ask Socrates, what is Socrates writing? So Socrates is writing a book. Now, sometimes this property gets called variable polyadicity. So Socrates can be, writes can be a monadic predicate, namely if he's Socrates writes, or it can be a polyadic predicate, Socrates writes a book. Both of those are perfectly good bits of semantics. But this example of writes is a good candidate for suggesting that the Stoics at least could extend their view of incomplete Lekta to include doubly incomplete Lekta. Okay. That's right. So the text is not obviously explicitly about that, but it does establish kind of the parameters. What I want to suggest, though, is that we find in this bit of Ammonius reason to think that the Stoics had a technical term for incomplete dyadic predicate, right? So incomplete a predicate with two subject spaces. And I'll just read you that text. And again, if what is predicated of a noun requires the addition of a case of a noun to produce an assertion, it is called or said to be less than a categorema, as in the case of likes and favors. For example, Plato likes. For only if whom is added to this, for example, Dio, does it produce a definite assertion, Plato likes Dio. Or loves Dio. So here we have this technical terminology for these dyadic predicates. You can't just say likes and you have to complete that, or you're suggested that you complete that here with Plato and Dio. So Plato likes Dio. Now, this idea of less than a predicate of the less than predicate, or what I've translated as less than predicate, is there all the way from the earliest bits of Stoicism, according to at least Bobzine and Shogri. So that's this is an argument that they present in their paper on this. Zeno rendered the end as living in agreement. His successors, further articulating this, expressed it thus: living in agreement with nature, since they took what Zeno said to be less than a predicate. Cleanthes added with nature and rendered it thus: the end is living in agreement with nature. So you have in Stoic semantics the resources to articulate this incompleteness reading, and it's very like the incompleteness reading in that it's about predicates, i.e. linguistic items, that are incomplete and doubly incomplete. And that's the analysis you get of relativity, both in this bit of the Stoics semantics and in the incompleteness view in the divisions of Aristotle. Okay. So then that's the general story. But then who specifically can we say was pushing this line, this reading of relativity. So the Stoics have the resources in their semantics to articulate this view of relativity. Was it ever articulated as a theory of relativity in the Stoic tradition? And I'm going to suggest now that it was. So here's when we're going to focus on this geezer, that's not an expression I've ever used before, Athenodorus. And here we know something about Athenodorus from Diogenes Laertius, and it goes, the followers of Chrysippus, Archidemus, Athenodorus, Antipater, and Crinis divide propositions into those that are simple and those that are not simple. So here what we have is Athenodorus accepting kind of orthodox Stoic semantic theory as true statements pick out a complete lecton with itself picks out a state of affairs. So what we have attributed to Athenodorus here is the view that he's sort of an orthodox Stoic when it comes to semantics, right? Now, what we don't have is exactly him being attributed this view of relativity, but we can think, well, if he was an orthodox Stoic in other bits of Stoic semantics, he was orthodox about other bits of Stoic semantics, then he was probably orthodox about this idea of incomplete and doubly incomplete Lekta, and less than predicates. Yeah, good. Okay, so let's say, for the sake of argument, I mean, that's the best evidence that I've got to say that Athenodorus signed up to this broadly orthodox Stoic picture of Lekta as doubly incomplete, or at least some Lekta as doubly incomplete. If that's right, then he could well have understood relatives as predicates, since they're linguistic items, and indeed as incomplete ones, insofar as they need syntactic or semantic incompletion. Here's some evidence to think that Athenodorus did that. This is Porphyry's from Porphyry's on the Categories. The followers of Athenodorus and Cornutus, who take the inquiry to be about words insofar as they are words, that inquiry is the Categories, e.g. about what is literal, what is a trope, and so on, for these are the differences between words insofar as they are words. Since this is what they think, they are confused. Since this is what they think, they are confused about what sort of things the categories are. And because they fail to discover this, they say that the division is defective for not encompassing every vocalization. So, yes, here we have a bit of evidence that Athenodorus thinks that Aristotle's categories as a whole is an investigation into words. Now, if that's right, a fortiori, the parts of the categories that are about relatives, namely category 7, will also be an inquiry about words. And if that's right, it seems as though the natural way for the Stoic to take it, category 7, would be in terms of Lekta, and in particular doubly incomplete Lekta. So that's, again, a bit of an inference from that piece of evidence, but we have good reason to think that Athenodorus took the overall inquiry, in particular the inquiry into relatives in category 7, as a linguistic inquiry. And then there is also some more direct evidence that Athenodorus signed up to such a reading. And this is from Simplicius' commentary on the categories. I'm going to just read this bit. Athenodorus thinks that, according to Aristotle, a relative is something, the term for which also suggests that it is in relation, suggests what it is said in relation to. If you hear slave, you wonder whose slave. Cornutus says that things are relative when the state of each thing is relative to the other, not as a matter of syntax, as having and being had, but as a matter of reality, when one thing is oriented towards another by being the very thing that it is. On neither of these accounts is rudder or wing a relative. They do not also suggest something which they are said in relation to, and they are not mentioned only as things whose real state is relative to something else. A rudder is a substance, and so is a head and a wing. So this passage needs a little bit of unpacking, because we're talking about some Stoics who are interpreting some bit of Aristotle, in particular Aristotle's category 7. So just take a moment to unpack that. So the bit that the bit of Aristotle's that Simplicius is commenting on here is the bit in category 7 where Aristotle raises this worry about reciprocity between relative and correlative. So he's worried that wing should relate to bird. Wing and bird should be correlatives, but they don't properly reciprocate, because a wing isn't always of a bird. It could be a wing of an insect. Same with a rudder. A rudder can be rudder of a ship, or it can be rudder of a boat, or what have you. So the worry is that you don't have this exclusive relationship between relative and correlative that I mentioned earlier. And so there was a substantial ancient debate about how to resolve this kind of issue. Athenodorus gets explicitly attributed the view that relatives are these incomplete predicates. If you hear the word slave, you wonder whose slave it is. We don't have to worry so much about Cornutus's view, because we're just focusing on Athenodorus. But the point that Aristotle goes on to make there, that Simplicius goes on to make in the last couple of sentences, is on the question, neither of these accounts is rudder or wing a relative. They do not also suggest something to which they are in relation to, and they're not mentioned only as things whose real state is relative to something else. A rudder is a substance, and so a head is a wing. So the thought here is that on Athenodorus's account, you don't have a problem with whether wing can relate to bird and insect, because of course it can, right? Because on the incompleteness view that Athenodorus has, or sorry, on the Stoic incomplete less than predicate view that Athenodorus has, exclusivity just doesn't come up, right? There's no problem with being a wing of a bird or a wing of a insect. So Simplicius's point is that Athenodorus can solve this problem that faces Aristotle by having Athenodorus's view of relativity, of what it counts as a relative predicate. Yes, and again, the episete, which we found in the earlier source as being a less than predicate, that seems to suggest, which we find here, which we find here as well, that suggests that what Athenodorus had was this technical notion of a less than predicate in mind. Okay. And again, I mean, the contrast with Cornutus' solution, we don't want to necessarily go into Cornutus' solution to this issue, but the contrast suggests that Athenodorus is solving the problem by moving to the linguistic level, whereas Cornutus wants to try and keep or solve the problem by staying on the world level. And again, that's further evidence that Athenodorus is the one with this incompleteness view of relativity that involves being on the kind of world semantic level rather than on the world level. I think I've already explained this, with the issue and how the incompleteness account is supposed to solve it. Yes, another interesting point about this source is that it makes plain that Cornutus was not the originator of the incompleteness view, since Cornutus is committed to the idea that being relative is not a matter of syntax, but a matter of reality. So it can't be that Cornutus is the one. We know, why would you think, it can't be that Cornutus is the one who originates this incompleteness view, even though we know that Cornutus wrote on or had views about Aristotle's views on relativity. Cornutus can't be the one who originates the incompleteness view, because he's still on the level of, his view is on the level of the world rather than on the level of semantics. Okay, so that's my story about where I think this all kind of comes from. The rest that's the bit that I've got evidence for. The rest is kind of speculation. What we would like is, so if that's right, basically the summary is Plato and Aristotle don't have the incompleteness view. the Stoics have the semantic resources for that view. Athenodorus, we know, was reading the categories, and he seems to have applied that Stoic semantic resources to solving these kinds of problems that crop up in category 7 to do with relativity. And effectively that amounts to giving the incompleteness view of relativity. The question then is, how did it get pushed into Plato? How does it get how does Plato end up with this view? Well, very, very briefly, I think the only plausible, or one plausible line of transmission would be Boethus of Sidon, the kind of peripatetic, first century peripatetic. And we know that he commented on, he in fact wrote a whole book about relativity. And in that book, it seems like these are the sorts of things he says about Plato. So Boethus says that Plato too gave an account of relatives in this way, as many are said to be what they are of other things, and it looks as if Boethus has forgotten what Plato said, for I would not assert that he did not know, being a distinguished person. For that, Plato characterizes relatives is not their being said in relation to one another, but by their being so in relation to each other. As Aristotle thinks too. Plato shows that the Republic and in the Sophist. So what's going on here is Simplicius giving Boethus a telling off for attributing to Plato the view that relatives are said in relation to each other. Now, it's unclear precisely what Boethus might have meant by this, but if we are taking as one distinctive feature of the incompleteness view that it is on the level of that it is a reading of relativity on the level of language, then that seems to be what Boethus is giving. Now, that would only be part of the incompleteness view, but it's some evidence that it's Boethus that's pushing the incompleteness view onto Plato. And also, because Boethus is a peripatetic, it would be nice because then the divisions of Aristotle would at least have some connection to Aristotle, right? If the incompleteness view is found in if the divisions of Aristotle is the one articulating that, it would be nice if we could find some peripatetic who attributed this view to Plato. So I'm wondering whether my speculation is that Athenodorus initially articulates this in his commentaries and discussion of category 7. Boethus picks this up and attributes it to Plato, and that's how we get into the divisions of Aristotle. I'm going to stop there because I've had now I've taken an hour of your time because of the thing, but thank you so much, and I hope that makes some sense, and thanks again. I'd love to hear your questions.
Thank you, Matt. Can you hear me? Matt?
I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So, questions, comments? Yes, Roberto Granier.
Thanks, Matt. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, Roberto. Lovely to hear you.
Hi. Nice. So, thanks very much. I have a very basic question of chronology. So, if I get it correctly, so you think that the divisiones do record a view of relativity in terms of incompleteness, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And you think the originator of this view is Athenodorus?
That's right. Yeah.
Now, to the best of my knowledge, I mean, the divisiones, I mean, the most recent treatment of the divisiones, namely the Randis, dates the divisiones at least back to the 4th century AC, whereas for what we know, Athenodorus was probably 1st century BC.
ABC?
BC, yeah, 1st century BC. I mean, it was probably a mentor of Augustus. So, I mean, I don't know if, how do you see the chronologies here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll have to figure out a better story about that then. If you think that the divisions goes back to the 4th century, is that right?
I mean, I'm just reporting what's the philologically most reliable treatment of this collection, which is the Randis paper. I think it's something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
BC.
BC.
The division is 4th century BC. Athenodorus is later. So my question is, if the divisiones record the incompleteness view, but Matt thinks the originator is Athenodorus, how do you read it?
Yeah. So, okay, good. Well, I don't have a, I mean, I don't have a, come clean, I don't have a good answer for that. So maybe that whoever writes maybe just going to have to think again about the chronology, or bracket these claims about the divisions of Aristotle. But yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks. That might just be an error. So yeah.
And also one thing, sorry, I mean, just to follow up on this, one, I mean, I wouldn't know how to prove this, but one way to, maybe not circumvent the difficulty, at least address it, would be that, I mean, one of the things that Durandi says is that the origin, I mean, the cell of that collection of divisiones dates back at least to the 4th century. I'm not entirely sure the reasons he gives are like super compelling, or at least, I mean, that you can't say otherwise. But one option may be that at least, I mean, you can speculate that at least the relevant divisiones, being 32, 69, I think it is, I mean, it's a later edition, right? So, I mean, this was probably a scholastic handbook. So, I mean, it would be just natural to add up new divisions as teachers would teach this material. So that may be an option.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, I
wouldn't know how to prove something like that. I mean, we don't.
Yeah. That's really good. So, I think the other thing to say here is that there's something like, I mean, you discussed this in your paper on this, right? There's something like 7 versions, and the relativity material crops up only in 2 of them, I think. This particular division crops up only in 2 of them. So that does suggest that at some point the divisions existed in a version without the relativity material. But yeah, I think that may be the best I can do without a better story about the chronology. And like you say, it's really hard to prove like when this bit was added. Maybe I could modus ponens your modus ponens and say, well, the fact that we don't find this before Athenodorus, or maybe Chrysippus actually kind of ended up on the end of the paper speculating that actually Chrysippus's reading of relativity appears in the list of his works underneath works on semantics. So I'm wondering whether it could even go back as far as Chrysippus. So maybe I could say, well, actually the evidence that this concept of divisions cropped up later was precisely that it wasn't in philosophical currency until the Stoics, until Athenodorus. Maybe that's the best I can do off the top of my head. But yeah, thanks. That's a great question.
Thank you.
Yes, Holmes. Yes, Vanessa, please.
I don't know where to look. Okay. How are you? Nice to see you.
Likewise.
Okay, so I think this is just a clarificatory question. So I like the emphasis that you put on the idea that relatives are objects. Okay, but relatives are also predicates.
Right.
Yes. Okay. So are Lekta objects?
Oh, good. Great. No, I don't think so. I mean, so what I was trying to say was that for Plato and Aristotle, they do crop up very often. The relatives crop up as objects, and then in the incompleteness view, they just can't be objects, or at least they can't be subjects of predication. So.
They were objects for the Stoics, I thought you argued that they are objects. Am I wrong about that?
I do argue for that. So I guess what I want to say is that this is on the level of, there's a story about how relative predication works that the Stoics have, and then that gets taken up as the way that relativity works in general. And then that's why we're reading back into Plato and Aristotle, this incompleteness view. But the Stoics could have a metaphysical picture on which you've got objects are relatives. And then how does the semantics around that metaphysics work? Well, it's in terms of incomplete Lekta. So if we want to make relative predications, we've got to have doubly incomplete Lekta. Does that make some sense of the?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. It's not that you're necessarily putting the Lekta into the role of being objects. It's really just a way to capture the relatives themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's great.
Sounds a bit like, I mean, yeah. Does that help?
Yes, that's good. I like that.
Right. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Edgar.
Yes. Hello. Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you.
Very interesting talk. I just wanted to ask you about. I mean, as you say in contemporary scholarship, is Owen who really pushed forward this interpretation of this linguistic interpretation of relatives. And so I think about the argument from relatives. I mean, the paper, the argument where Owen introduced this view. What do you think about Alexander? Do you think that Alexander holds this linguistic interpretation of relatives, especially when he discusses the argument in his commentary on the metaphysics, or not?
That's a brilliant question. It never occurred to me. Does Alexander hold this view? This linguistic view. I have to think about that. I can't now remember what I said. I did have a line on this in the book on. I had a line on the relatives argument in the Periodion. I think Alexander is still in the more Aristotelian picture of these are objects that have objects as correlatives, and we're on the kind of world level. Partly because he seems to think of he takes very seriously this idea that comes up in the in Aristotle of a relative being a kind of paraphuton or something, a kind of offshoot of a substance. So I think Alexander's still on the world level when he's understanding that argument. But I'd have to go back and think about. I really want to now go back and look at that argument again and think. Actually, how do we track the concept of relatives that Alexander's working with? And I'd also need to look more at Alexander because I've not really thought about how relativity works in Alexander at all. Yeah. So if you have thoughts on that, that would be great.
Well, I agree with you. I think that especially as he describes Aristotle's criticisms, he says, what is interesting in the first place is that the argument that he reports it does not contain at all the term prosti, right?
Yes.
Or katauto, for example, right? He just uses the predicate, contrasted predicates man or human and equal. And then when Alexander criticizes the argument, he says, well, he said, Aristotle, that this argument produces forms even of relatives. At least the form was produced in relation to equal, which is a relative. Right, so it seems to be like an interpretation. So that term doesn't appear, of course, at all in Plato. And then when he goes on, he says something like, as you say, that it's not right to posit forms of relatives because forms are subsist katauta because they are certain substances for the Platonists.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But relatives have their being in one relation to the other.
Exactly.
Not talking about being, not about words.
Exactly.
But what I'm interested also is because Fine, as you know, Fine has a chapter on katauto versus prosti in Alexander, I think. And
who has? Sorry.
Fine in her book.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
Gail Fine has a chapter on katauto versus prosti.
That's right.
Where I think she argues, of course, that Alexander has this complete view of predicates.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's how she's coming from it. So she's coming to it. She takes she thinks that Plato has this incompleteness view.
Yes.
But I can't now remember how I felt, whether I felt that impacted her reading of the argument. I'd have to go back and have a look at what Fine says about it. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Brooke, please.
Thank you so much. I have just another clarificatory question, because I found your account of relatives in the book really helpful. And so I wanted to just maybe piggyback on what Vanessa asked so I could make sure I understand how the argument here relates to the argument.
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so I think that makes sense that what you've just described is thinking about how relatives are constituted as predicates, and that corresponds to a primary distinction of, how relatives might be constituted as objects, where there's continuity between the Stoics and Plato and Aristotle in sort of privileging the idea of relatives as objects, right? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And then you draw this distinction between the differentiated relatives are constituted as corporeal, but the relatively disposed objects are constituted as abstract objects.
Right. Yeah.
So they're incorporeals.
Right. I suppose so. Yeah. I suppose they would have to be. Yeah. That's what I was thinking, but I don't think I made that claim in the book because I wasn't certain of it. But yeah, is that right?
That's what I'm asking you. Yeah, I'm just trying to an abstract object isn't incorporeal, right?
Okay. An abstract for the Stoics, you mean an abstract object might be incorporeal? Yeah, good. I don't actually know. I mean, I've not put the metaphysics together well enough, I think. So the thought is, if I've got a differentiated relative, that would be something like being sweet, and that's going to be in virtue of some corporeal features of the sweetness. The sweetness can be present in it. If I've got a non-differentiated relative like being a parent, then that seems like it's an abstract feature, an abstract object that's going to supervene on some corporeal bodies. Is that my thing? I honestly can't remember what I said, but yeah, let's go with that. And then you think that the father should be is not going to be an abstract; it's going to be a corporeal. I think that's okay. Is that fine?
I mean, honestly, like I'm kind of working this out. You'll see in my paper, I'm trying to. I think that you're picking out a relative, an important contrast between these two kinds of relatives, where one is constituting bodies through their capacity to act, and the other is constituting them in another way. So as either as incorporeals, but I'm also trying to figure out for my own purposes, is this about different kinds of categories, as you argue, or is this about a distinction between the physics and metaphysics, which is actually in chapter 10, what you do is map the different relatives, the implications of the different kinds of relatives onto physics and metaphysics. So I'm just trying in my head to figure out how those two oppositions work together, right?
I see, yeah.
For
So
you.
the-
And now we add semantics where that comes into play.
Yeah. So to come clean, I haven't got a worked out story about how all of these bits fit together. So particularly with the semantics, like this is just this is a little bit more exploratory. So I'm quite happy to. I mean, I'd love to know what the best way to go on this is. I think. I mean, my head hasn't been in this topic for a little while, so I don't think I'm going to do a terribly good job of kind of ad-libbing something. But maybe the best would be if we could talk about it. If we maybe talk about it over email, or
Yeah, that's great.
So that I can get my head back into. So I can get my head back into it before I before I say something, rather than just say something kind of random off the cuff. Is that okay?
Perfect.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, Vanessa.
Oh, yeah. Okay. This is just a follow up to what you were saying with Brooke. So it sounded like you were embracing the idea of the predicates in that conversation as being something like abstract objects. You know, sometimes people take them to be states of affairs or facts or whatever. In that case, of course, it's not just that the Lekta or the incomplete predicates are just ways of talking about the world or ways of talking about the object. So those two positions are a little bit at odds with each other, I think.
Right. Yeah. Good. I mean, what I guess what I wanted for the non-differentiated relatives, things like father is a story, or parent is a story where you've got to make sense of how they can be exclusively related to their correlative object. So, and then it seems like they can't just be, it can't just be Socrates as a father, and because then Socrates can be father of Dion and also father of Theon. So then he's not exclusively related. And the way that I wanted to try and solve that problem was by moving from the idea that the relative objects are concrete particulars to the idea that they are objects, but abstract objects, like the father as such is relative to the offspring as such, or something like that. And that would ensure that there's this exclusive relationship between the relative and correlative, right? You can't end up being, the father as such isn't going to be father of Dion or Theon or anything else like that. It would just be that the father as such is relative to the offspring as such. So that was what that was maybe I'm wrong about what counts as an abstract object here. And it's a really good point that those things are going to have to be, the father is going to have to be a corporeal, I guess, for the Stoics. So yeah, that was just that's simply that's not to answer the question anyway. That's simply maybe to explain more my confusion. Yeah,
you have some decisions to make, I think.
Yeah, good. This is great. So I mean, this is one of these things where I worked out of you in the book, and then I'm still sort of trying to work through some of the consequences of it. So this is great. Thanks very much.
Okay, may I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Matt, look, one question has to do with something that that you have been asked already, which is, it's related to the topic of the status of the things that are relatives in the incompleteness view, right?
Yeah.
If it is a Stoic view, the incompleteness view, and if it is a view that originates with the Stoic, then of course, yes. I mean, so how do you understand the opposition between a linguistic relation and a world relation?
Right.
The
Good.
That is this: is that for the Stoics, predicates are something, no, but they are incorporeal. So is the contrast between a linguistic relation and a non-linguistic relation a contrast between a relation between incorporeals, which is what would correspond to the linguistic view, and a relation between bodies, which would be the opposite, no? Is that a contrast? Or is it your view rather the following, that the linguistic view is not that relativity is a relation between Lekta or predicates, but rather between the words that we use to express Lekta. No, like Lexis, for example. No? So a Lexis for the Stoics is a body. So if that's your view, then the contrast between a linguistic relation and a non-linguistic one is rather a contrast not between an incorporeal a relation between incorporeals and a relation between bodies, but rather a contrast between a relation between certain bodies, namely
Great.
which are linguistic items, but they are bodies nonetheless, and other bodies which are not linguistic items, but are also bodies. No, so it's so the contrast there is not between corporeal and incorporeal, but rather between different kinds of bodies. No, so how do you? I mean, how should we understand then the contrast between incompleteness, between relativity as a relation, as a linguistic relation, and relativity as a relation between non-linguistic? No, I mean, what of these two options I mentioned? What is
this is great.
The one that you like better?
Yeah.
Or
so, gosh, I think the way I was thinking of it is that we're on the level of Lekta.
Yes. Okay.
Because for the reason that some of these Lekta will have variable polyodicity. So it seems as though that is a semantic feature. So if I say, Socrates writes, that can be complete on its own, or it can be completed. Now, if it were and that seems a semantic feature that you need to bring in some context in order to make the proposition make sense, right? So I think that they would be Lekta are the predicates, and then the question is, what are the subjects of those Lekta? But that isn't a special. I think that's not a special question for this paper. That's just like, well, how do the Lekta relate to bodies? And whatever your answer to the question of how Lekta relate to bodies, I'm just going to piggyback on that. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does. So, sorry, what I wanted to say is whether the relation, right, is an incorporeal, or namely a predicate, or it's a corporeal relation between bodies, which would have case if we. I think
that the relations are incorporeals.
Yes. Okay.
Because essentially because of relative change. So that where this gets discussed in the source in Simplicius, where he gives this two different divisions of relativity. One of them is supposed to be sensitive to relative change, and so at least some Stoic relatives, the Lekta, are going to be sensitive to relative change. Why is that? Well, if they were bodies, you wouldn't be able to get relative change. You wouldn't be able to get Socrates going from being true of Socrates that he's larger to being true of him that it's smaller. Well, if the relative is a body, then it doesn't seem like simply by comparing Socrates one way versus comparing him another way, or moving him from one place to another, he would change his relative properties. Does that help?
Yes, it helps. So this has to do with my second question, which is the following. You say that something essential in the relativity, in the incompleteness view of relativity, is the idea that all things in the category of relativity are linguistic items. No, you say that, and then but then you argue that this incompleteness view of relativity doesn't go back to Plato.
Yeah.
But why is that exactly? Is it because in Plato, relativity, things in the category of relativity are not linguistic items, but rather objects in the world? I mean, is that the reason why in Plato you don't have that?
Yes.
Right. No, because in Plato you do find the idea of incompleteness. No, for example, in the Symposium passage, on pages 3 and 4, it says a brother just insofar as he's a brother. No? And a brother is so. You find in Plato the idea of relativity or of incompleteness. No?
Yeah.
The trouble with Plato is that relativity is a relation between, not between linguistic items, but between objects. Is that
Yeah. So I think that those kinds of issue. So why is it that so I don't think Plato has the incompleteness view because he thinks that relatives are items in the world. That's the main difference, right?
Yes.
So he doesn't think of relativity as being spelled out in linguistic terms or in semantic terms. But it's true that when you come to specify the nature of being a brother or being a father, you do have to mention correlatives. Right. So if I'm giving you an account or a definition of being a parent, I'm just going to not have done a good enough job if I don't mention offspring. Right. What is it to be a parent? Well, it's got to be a parent of offspring. It can't just be a parent because you have some non-relational features. Does that make sense? So,
yes.
So that's how I think it gets in with Plato. And then again, however you think of the relationship between essential features and objects and things in Plato, because these relations, as it were, are going to be essential features. You're going to have to be they're the features that you're going to have to mention when you're giving the nature of an object. So however you think that essential features relate to normal objects in Plato, then I want to plug the story in there. Does that help? Does that help?
It does, yes. Well, thank you very much. Anything else?
Yes. Very small question, Matt. I gathered that all the, this paper that you presented today assumes the results of your previous research on relativity and tries to account for, when this incompleteness view of relativity comes up in ancient philosophy. So I don't really want to go into the assumptions here. I mean, the basis of this account. But I'm just wondering one thing. Couldn't it be the case that, and this also builds up a bit on your question, Ricardo. I mean, is it that, what if Plato and or Aristotle have a view of relativity whereby relativity is, prosody are first and foremost things, but there are also linguistic expressions that mirror the this metaphysical state of affairs, meaning the relativity between two relata.
Yeah.
And completeness comes in only at the linguistic level. And then when it comes to, if your account today is right, when it comes to later people like the Stoics, they focus only on one of this aspect. So, what I'm wondering is, are these two exclusive options, or couldn't it just be that the Stoics were focusing on one single, especially because of whatever that may be, their ontology, the ontology behind it, and their view of
great. That's really helpful. So, I mean, I wonder if that kind of, it spells out, it comes quite close to what I'm saying in a way, because I don't think, I'm not sure, I don't find any evidence in Plato and Aristotle that they really do think in linguistic terms at all about relativity. They just seem to think about it as, well, perhaps that's not true. There is stuff in there in the text that, you know, people have picked up on to say that it is in Aristotle in particular in category 7, relatives are said to be relative to something else, and that of course could be very linguistic. So maybe that is nice, and I can just say, well, look, like along the lines of the Stoics, because of their ontology and their semantics, they're really picking up on this reading of Aristotle in particular as spelling out relativity in linguistic terms, and they maybe think that is the right way to read Aristotle because of they've got this semantics. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, that's great. I think I can take that point and run with it, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Matt, for your paper.
Oh, thank you so much.